Good evening. Welcome to the Planning and Zoning Board meeting for September 20th, 2016. If I may ask you at this time to please rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance in a moment of silence. Thank you. May we please have roll call from left to right?
Richard Lutz.
Mike Dolan.
John Grant.
Edward Mead.
Carl S. Moore.
Scott Marlowe.
Tom Nickel.
Tom Panzala.
Jim Quish.
I'm Anthony Sutton, Board Chairman, and we are joined this evening by Joseph Griffith, Director of the Department of Permitting and Land Use, and Board Secretary and Board Clerk, Phyllis Leggett. One change to the agenda this evening, item D4, which is the public hearing regarding regulation changes regarding electronic digital billboards. At the request of the petitioner, that is going to be continued to the October 4th meeting agenda. That just arose shortly before the meeting, so that will not be taken up this evening. Our first item of business is CGS 8-24 approval. It is the request to purchase a portion of 0 Indian Hill Road, map 37, block 520A, by Lisa Lesso for access to a proposed single-family lot. And presenting this evening is Attorney Kevin Kersaden. Good evening, Attorney Kersaden.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Kevin Kersaden for Lisa Lesso. My office is at 26 Cherry Street here in Milford. Our associate, Christina Porter, is passing out a package. I don't want you to scare you by the size of the package. I'm not asking you to read the whole thing. I'm going to give you a history of the property and explain what we're asking for, and the documents contained in the package support that explanation and support our application. So at the front is our memo of request. I just kept it to one page to try to keep it simple for you. To orient you, this property is at the end of Myers Lane, which is off of Oldfield Lane. The request is simple. We're asking the board to approve the transfer of 0.07 acres. It's a little under 3,000 square feet of land that has no deed restriction on it, is not inland wetlands, so that the property owner, who right now owns 2 lots at the end of Myers Lane, 1 lot with a house on it that's been part of the original Gulf Acres or Myers Lane subdivision, and 1 lot that is a vacant lot that was left over or part of the original Indian Hill subdivision, which is Indian Hill runs behind or adjacent, parallel to Myers Lane, depending on how you look at it. And the reason they're asking for this is because right now this lot, although it meets all the other requirements as far as lot size, width, we've shown on the set of plans, which I have in front of you, and it's in the board package. We've shown that you can meet all the requirements to put a house on this lot, but what it doesn't have is lot frontage on a city street. So that means it would have to be considered a rear lot. The applicant has been looking at this off and on for 10 or 12 years now, and originally it was Public Works Director Bruce Kolwitz, who we met with years ago, and he was not in favor of it, and it was just kind of a cursory meeting, and we talked a few times, and then that was it. We talked to Mr. Sulkus about a possible rear lot, which he was not in favor of and which we would need variances for. There's some pictures that hopefully you're able to pass amongst yourselves that kind of show the property and the land area we're talking about. But the, I guess, compounding factor is not only are we not on a city street, but there's city property that separates this lot from the city street. So when you look at Myers Lane, it looks like, and you look at some of the pictures there, it looks like this city street could have just been extended down to in front of this lot. That was, however, not part of the original subdivision plan, so that's not a paper street. The land there was dedicated to the city of Milford as part of the subdivision approval in October of 1969. At that time, the subdivision regulations were different than what Milford has now. So 47 years ago, there was talk of recreational areas, parks, and setting aside some land for that type of thing. The regulations that were in effect at this time were from 1964, and they mentioned open space, but they mentioned it in the context of public open space, as if it was some usable open space area that somebody could go hiking or some type of passive recreation. The land that's been dedicated to the city of Milford is City of Milford City of Milford property, owned by the city, but there's a no trespassing sign there. My client, one of my clients, Mrs. Lesso's husband, Mark, his family has owned this property since 1970, and there's never been any active use of that public space area. So the decision for an 8-24, in this case, it's entirely up to you because the parcel's not deed restricted, there's no wetlands, there's nothing legally preventing you from approving the request. But you should have the benefit of basing your decision on all of the facts, not just some opinions or assumptions or assertions, and I'll get to those briefly in a minute. This is just the first step. If you approve this, this is just an advisory approval. It still needs to go to the Board of Aldermen for a more formal approval or the final approval. And then the applicant would need to come back in for a re-subdivision approval and go to wetlands and site plan and go through all the same city agencies that they've been through that have commented on this application. There's a couple of staff reports that are in. I don't know if you've had time to look at them. Steve Johnson his main concern was that he believes it was considered open space. I take serious issue with that because there's nothing. It's one thing if it was in the minutes or in the record from 1969 or on the subdivision map that this was supposed to be open space. That's not the case. There's no indication that it's supposed to be limited to open space. It's land dedicated to the city of Milford. It doesn't say what the future intent is. There is the record map does not mention open space. There are a couple of maps floating around in the zoning file. One of the maps, and I have it here if anyone wants to take a look at it, I can show you, says this exact area that we're talking about, it says proposed Myers Lane extension. Now that's not the final approved map, but it's just evidence that there was other discussions about what was going to be used for what the use of this property was going to be. There's been comments that the parcel, if you grant this request, the city parcel would be landlocked. That's not the case for two reasons. One, the lessos have offered a full and perpetual easement over the property that was requested by Chris Saley a couple of years ago when we started this application in a more serious mode back in 2014. The second reason is that the city owns 33 acres of contiguous open space or wetlands with access from at least Oldfield Lane and Welch's Point. So this parcel, it will never be landlocked. Other staff comments were minimal with no real concerns. Mary Rose from Inland Wetlands had a couple of comments about what, you'd have to come in for a Inland Wetlands Agency approval. The Conservation Commission, I was just at their meeting earlier tonight. They were out on site on August 9th, and they was there tonight to get clarification on what their recommendation was. Their recommendation was supportive of the application, not negative towards the application, but they won't officially take a motion to approve or deny. But they had a list of recommendations as part of that approval if this application was approved overall by Planning and Zoning and Board of Aldermen. all of which the applicant's willing to comply with. So, just briefly going through the history, this lot that we're trying to gain access to is the back portion of a lot that was approved by the Indian Hill subdivision. It's been taxed as a lot for years, I think since 1976 as its own lot. I put a stack of assessor information in that package just to briefly touch on that. It was actually taxed as a buildable lot or a potential building lot for many years without it actually being an approved building lot. So both the Lessos and their predecessors, which is Mr. Lesso's parents, paid taxes on this lot for a number of years as if it was a buildable lot. The plan, if this were to be approved, would be to go to the Board of Aldermen, seek their approval, and then if we were fortunate enough to have that happen, would be to come back in with an application for a house that is exactly or very similar to all the other houses in the neighborhood, which is a small to mid-sized raised ranch house, something in character with the neighborhood. One of the other things that is in your package is proposed policies for 8-24 approval. I drafted those as part of this process. They have no legal weight over you whatsoever. It's just a suggestion because in speaking with the mayor's office about 8-24s, the policy as it was explained to me was that, well, if you get the neighbor's consent or buy-in, then I'll support it and it will come from the mayor's office. And I respectfully disagree with that policy. I think that causes problems between the neighbors, and I think that there's no objective standard to that. The mayor respectfully disagreed with me and said, if you want to file it, you can file it, on your own as an 8-24, but it's not going to come through my office. So he didn't really take a position, yes or no. He just wasn't able to. He had to stay neutral because we didn't get the consent of neighbors. That's a little bit confusing, and that's why I suggested those proposed policies. It might give you some criteria for an objective standard going forward if you ever wanted to adopt something like that. It becomes difficult to know, well, what neighbors do I need consent from? And what kind of consent do I need from the neighbors? Do I need them to sign something? Do I need them to come to the hearing and say, I don't have an issue with it? So it just becomes very, very confusing and difficult for somebody to actually get the neighbor's consent. I do have, if you want them, somebody has any question on it, the old subdivision regulations that I talked about briefly. And I think I've spoken long enough on it. If anybody has any questions for me.
Thank you, Mr. Casaden. Mr. Griffith, do you have a comment on the petitioner?
I think, I know you've got the correspondence and documentation that we've received, and it's been passed out to the board, and I think Attorney Casaden's summary accurately reflects the opinions of the various offices and commissions.
Thank you. Are there questions from the board for the petitioner? Mr. Nichol.
Yeah, there's a statement here that said that will not disturb the wetlands. And I see that there's another statement here. It says inland wetland has really no objection to this. However, they cannot approve it because they don't have a plan.
Correct. So the reason, the way it was circulated through the different city agencies, the purpose for the circulation was 8-24 approval. It was not a site plan approval. So until they get a formal inland wetlands application with a site plan, wetlands can't act on it. But the land we're requesting to be transferred is moved away. It's a small driveway that's away from the wetlands. And we've also, as part of this process over the past couple of years, I've met with Mary Rose on a few occasions to make sure that we were, working within what she felt comfortable with.
Are there any additional questions for Attorney Casaden at this time? Mr. Marlowe.
Well, just maybe a question. I see the documentation here from the assistant city's attorney that says it will be landlocked, but I hear you saying that it won't be landlocked.
That's correct.
I'm just not sure
Yeah.
where do we head with that.
Yeah,
Is it-
thanks for bringing that up, actually. I got that, and I actually called the assistant city attorney, and I had a brief phone call conversation with her, and I said, and I also sent a letter. I don't know if a copy of that letter is in your file, but the letter said, if you knew that we were offering a full easement, would that resolve your concern? And this was on Friday, and if you have time to respond before Tuesday night, that would be very helpful. So I emailed that to the assistant city attorney and the city attorney, and then I followed that up with a phone call to the assistant city attorney who wrote the memo, Deborah Kelly. And her and I had a brief conversation, and she said, well, why can't you just tell the board that an easement would, resolve that issue? And I said, because it's been my experience, even though I've been doing this for almost 20 years now and have a lot of land use experience, that boards don't necessarily automatically believe the applicant's attorney. So we left it where I said, hey, look, obviously I can't direct the city attorney's office to do anything, but I explained my dilemma, and I anticipated a question or concern like that. And as of today, I have not received anything from them. But I can tell you as an attorney, what I've told you tonight resolves the landlocked issue. If you offer a full and perpetual easement over that, there wouldn't be any building or structures within that area. Yep.
Additional questions for Attorney Crusaden, Mr. Lutz?
Yeah, if I'm looking at this, this is approximately a third of an acre, is that the size of the landlocked piece?
It is, I believe so. It's about, excuse me for a minute. That's correct.
I believe that there's a requirement for a rear lot to be at least an acre.
You're correct. That's why we're here. Because the reason for this, if you look at the end of Myers Lane is, the street itself is 50 feet wide. So in this zone, you need 50 feet of frontage. So the reason we're using the end of the street as the 50 foot of frontage, if you were, and the Board of Aldermen were to grant this request. Otherwise, you're correct, it is a rear lot, and that's the conversation we had with Mr. Sulkus a few years ago, and we would have to get variances for both lots. We would have to get a variance for the potential building lot because it's undersized, and we'd have to get a variance for this lot because there would be a driveway over this 20 Myers Lane, the adjoining lot, onto the new lot.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anything further for Attorney Crusaden? Mr. Quish?
Would it be feasible to take that portion of land that you're looking to buy from the city and have that be, and pay for that to become a cul-de-sac, and then have that be an extension of the road, giving access to the lot, so it's now conforming?
We had that discussion with the Public Works Director now, Chris Saley, and Mary Rose, because there's no room there by the wetlands in order to have a cul-de-sac. It would cause disturbance or filling of the wetlands. Mary Rose was not in favor of that. Chris Saley's response was that he wouldn't be in favor of that, but he wanted a snow shelf, a gravel snow shelf, and I think and an easement. He also wanted that easement that I discussed earlier. So there's really no room there for that. Chris, the Public Works Director's other comment was that the cul-de-sacs are very difficult to plow, and that he preferred just a straight shot of a snow shelf versus a cul-de-sac. So we did explore that, and we were told that not to go in that direction. Thanks.
Any additional questions? Seeing none at this time, we'll entertain a motion as to the 824 request. Does anyone wish to make a motion? Mr. Quish?
I would make a motion to send this off to the aldermen for their either approval or negotiation.
Is there a second? Mr. Panzella? Does anyone wish to be heard on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion to approve this 824? Aye, say aye. Aye.
Let me do this.
Please, all opposed? The motion passes. Thank you very much. Our next item of business is 284-288 Broad Street, Zone MCDD, position of Ken Pinelli for site plan review approval for a change of use from commercial to mixed use to create an office and 3 apartments on map 44, block 430, parcel 19, of which 288 Broad Street LLC is the owner. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, everybody. Today, I'm going to be presenting our project for 284 Broad Street. Now, my father did just hand out a packet of photos that I'm going to be going through that might help you get a better picture of what's going on here. So on the first photo here, you're going to see 284 Broad Street on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you're going to see 288 Broad Street, which we currently own. We run our insurance agency, Summit Financial Group, out of there. My father has owned 288 Broad Street for 17 years. Just a little bit of a background on my father. He's been a lifelong Milford resident, and over the years he has acquired quite a few properties here in Milford, and has a deep respect for the town, and really enjoys having his properties close by, both to his business and his home.
Sir, if I could just have you identify yourself and your father by
I'm
name
sorry.
for the
Yes.
record, please.
My name is Eric Pinelli. I'm Ken and Karen's son. You're welcome. Just to review our statement of use again, currently this is all office use, 284 Broad Street in the MCDD district. Now our proposal is to convert this from an all office use building to a mixed use building. On the first floor, we will have all office use, approximately 1,290 square feet. On the second floor will be all residential use. It'll be 430 square feet in the front. That'll be an efficiency on the second floor. And in the rear portion of the second floor will be a 1-bedroom apartment, approximately 602 square feet. And then we are proposing a 3rd story on the rear of the building, which will also accommodate another 1-bedroom apartment. And these improvements tonight being proposed are a permitted use. Now, if you flip to the second picture, you will get a view of the rear portion of the building. Now, please note the current shape of the building. You will see that the building is on an angle. Now, when this addition was made in the 1980s, Timothy Sharp was the owner at the time, along with his partner. Really, this was just an addition to, obtain more space. Really wasn't anything that was aesthetically appealing, done as cheaply as possible, and really isn't a very attractive looking building. So also, you can't really tell from the first photo, but the front of the building is not square as well. About halfway, at the halfway point of the building, that entrance does jut out about 4 feet, and then the left portion of the building is recessed in. Really, our whole proposal with this building is to try and bring its aesthetic appeal back. If you do refer to photo number 3, it'll be the same copy of the elevation that you see on the board here to help you give a clearer picture of what's going on with what we want to do in basically rectifying the shape and proportions of the building. So in the front, you will see we are trying to restore the original appeal and aesthetic of the building. You will see two entrances on the right-hand side. We are proposing that that will be the entrance to the apartments on the second and third story. And on the left-hand side, that will be an entrance for the office space. So we're trying to create two different entrances, make it a little bit nicer and more appealing. That addition in the front is approximately 40 square feet. And also, please note in the rear, if you look at the southern elevation on the same page, you'll get a better picture of what we're trying to accomplish with squaring off the building. Real briefly, again, if you're looking at photo number 2, we are proposing to remove those Bilco doors. We are trying to create an entrance that will give access to the apartment renters. There will be storage space down there for them. Also for the office renters, there will be space for them to go down there. It'll be a much nicer access. Those wooden stairs going up to the second story, those are not up to code. Quite frankly, they're dangerous. They're difficult to clean in the winter. We will be foregoing those stairs. And we are also proposing balconies for each apartment unit. We feel that'll be a nice feature for the apartment unit renters, and also add a little bit more of an aesthetic to the building. Now, in fixing the rear portion of the building, we are proposing a very minor lot line adjustment. As I stated before, back when the addition was made in the 1980s, there was a 5-foot setback on the side of the building. That is no longer the case. It's a 0 setback. So if we keep that same lot line, the new foundation to square off the rear portion of that building will be past that line approximately 1.5 feet. So our minor lot line adjustment will accommodate squaring and bringing back both the roof line and the aesthetic of the building, as well as granting usable space for the second, first, and third stories. Now, again, like I said, our whole reasoning behind this, we obviously want to make the building look pretty. The addition to the front of the building is going to allow separate accesses to both the office and the apartment spaces. As you can see, we are proposing a gambrel roof design. Really, we feel that the MCDD sets forth what they want to see in the buildings surrounding Milford Center. We're trying to bring both our building, 288 Broad Street, and kind of make it look similar in a way that they're connected. We feel that the MCDD defines that we're trying to fulfill unique characteristics of the town and really capture the aesthetic appeal and the balance between the naturally and built environment. Now, if you flip to photo number 5, this is just the proposed colors that we would like to use for the building. We are proposing that we're going to use hardy plank siding. We really liked the material. We're going with neutral colors that we feel will blend in nicely with the surrounding areas. The bottom, it's a woodstock brown. We're going to use timber bark for the trim, or for the upper trim portions, and then all the exterior trim around the exterior portions, windows and whatnot, are going to be cobblestone, a nice white contrast. And really, the whole idea of this project is for it to be as quality as possible. We're going to put a lot of pride and effort into making this a very appealing building. Now, if you flip to photo number 6, I'll talk a little bit about the landscape. Now, this is the green area behind 284 and 288 Broad Street. We felt this would be a very nice area for the apartment unit renters to go out back and enjoy the outdoors. It's a very nice shaded area. Torrey Brook runs along the back there, and David Sulkus was excited about that being there, with our idea of having the apartment unit renters enjoy that space. As for the rest of the porous area around the lot, we're going to be landscaping the entire thing. We're going to be using unique pine trees from Oregon, Korean fir trees, Chinese junipers, Hinoki cypress trees, gray owls, just a lot of really nice high-end plants. We have already removed about 20 years of debris in the back portion of the lot, which really opened the space up. It uncovered some parking spaces that were covered for many, many years. And really, we plan to irrigate the whole area like we do with all of our properties and have it be very, very nice. The interior landscaping was one of the concerns that David Sulkus brought up. Just due to the non-conforming parking lot that is currently there, we are not changing anything with the current parking situation. So we are going to forego that. It would impede with the functionality of the parking lot itself. So we are keeping that as is. If you do flip to the next page, this is just a picture of our totes that we have behind 288 Broad Street. We do not utilize a dumpster. Again, we're really trying to focus on the fine details here. We would really like to use something much less intrusive, like these totes that you could see on Richard Plain's survey as well, where we would place the totes. Just feel it would be much cleaner, and also instead of a heavy dump truck going down the pavement and ruining it over the years, we felt this was a much better alternative. Again, the next picture is just the dumpster that is currently on the property of 284 Broad Street, which we will be getting rid of. And then with the lighting situation, there was a little bit of a concern about the lumen rating being past 0.05 onto 288. But again, we own the property, and really it would only benefit because there really is no lighting on the property. And really the rest of the photos at the end of the packet, just pictures of the properties that we do own. Hopefully give you a good idea of how we keep our properties, that we take a lot of pride in home ownership. And we're really excited about this project to make it something beautiful, not only for ourselves to be happy about, but the rest of the residents in Milford to say, wow, this is a really nice project. That's pretty much it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pinelli.
Thank you.
Mr. Griffith, do you have comment on the application?
No, I know David Sulkus, our city planner, has worked very closely with the Pinellis to bring this application in compliance with our regulations. I know David has provided his administrative summary here, which makes reference to the city engineer's recommendations. City engineer said briefly that there are no outstanding engineering issues, so I think we're all set with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for the petitioner from the board? Any questions from the board for the petitioner? Mr. Nickel?
Yeah, 284, is that under construction already?
I'm sorry, what is that?
284, is that under construction at this time?
No, it is not.
Seems to be a lot going on in there.
Well, really, we were just cleaning out some of the clutter that was in there. Really, we haven't been doing anything other than just cleaning some of the surrounding area, like we said. Greg Podluski had stopped out there. We had cleaned the rear portion of the building. We got permission to clean up the rear portion of the building with the debris and whatnot from the plow over the 20 years. And that's pretty much what's been going on.
No, I was out there the other day. Seems like there's stuff going on inside the building on 284.
Yeah. What we were doing is we were removing some of the electrical in the basement. So that's what was going on. It took about 2 months for them to turn the power off for us to do that, so.
Are there additional questions for the petitioner? Mr. Mead?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the additional apartments, is there enough parking for?
Yes, so if you do look at the plans that we gave you, it will mention that the bottom portion, the office space, is 1,290 square feet. It is 250 square feet per parking space, which equals about 5.1. The efficiency counts as one space, and the 2 one-bedroom apartments take up 1.5 spaces. We do have 11 total spaces there, so we're coming in right around 9 spaces.
Thank
Any additional questions? Seeing none, does anyone wish to make a motion? Mr. Quish?
You know, just a quick comment first, is that obviously if you look at the building, it was built as a residential building initially.
Correct.
And so to have that be mixed use is consistent with our plan of conservation and development, and I would make a motion to approve.
Thank you.
Is there a second? Mr. Lutz?
Yep.
Does anyone wish to be heard in favor of the motion, or wish to be heard on the motion, rather? Seeing none, we'll call the question to a vote. All in favor of the motion? All opposed? The motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda is a public hearing for proposed text regulation changes. It is the petition of Kevin Kersaden for a change in the zoning regulations to Article 3, Section 3.1.4.1, Figure 2, height, Article 11, Section 2, definitions, base flood elevation, building height within a flood hazard area, building height in SFHA zones AE or VE, design flood elevation, freeboard, height measuring point. And there is a note on the agenda that the proposed regulation changes in their entirety are on file with the Planning and Zoning Office. Thank you. Good evening again, Mr. Kersaden.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. For the record, Kevin Kersaden. My office is at 26 Cherry Street. I'm actually I'm representing the applicants on this matter, Donna Weaver and Jack Turek, who are owners of 59 Hillside in Milford. They are the applicant. They're here this evening in the audience. As you know, the board's authority for regulation changes stems from CGS 8-2, 8-3, and 8-3B. When deciding a reg change, the board acts in a legislative capacity, and it's entirely at your discretion. Notice was published in the town clerk's office, and we've given Phyllis a copy of that notice. It's been probably a month or two, so I think the minimum requirement is 10 days, so we've met that statutory requirement. This has been circulated to the Regional Council of Governments and the appropriate regional zoning agencies and Connecticut Deep, and I think John Goucher had a response that it wasn't inconsistent with the Connecticut Coastal Management Act, and a copy of that email's been given to Phyllis for the record as well. There's a couple of, I have a table of contents and I have minutes from 2008, and I'll just walk briefly through the package that was handed out to you. The minutes from, the reason I have the minutes from 2008 is because prior to 2008, Milford's regulations with regard to building height were something along the lines of 35 feet tall or 4 stories, excluding the basement. That language allowed residential structures to be built that were over 35 feet in height because of the or 4 stories language. So there was an interpretation due to the language that allowed buildings to be built either 4 stories high or 35 feet. So the regulations were changed, and there was at one point in time, and I think the board might have just got rid of that this regulation I'm about to speak of in March of this year, where they said anything over 4 feet tall is considered a story. So then that brought it back down to the 3 feet, the 3 stories or 35 feet. So back in 2008, there have been some houses damaged by more minor storms than when we had, if you want to, Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy or Hurricane Irene, or just due to age, and there was new construction, or those houses back then were either being rehabbed or torn down or were being elevated. This was before the flood maps were amended in 2015. So the reg changes back then were made by the board were geared toward limiting the height on the shoreline. And certain members on the board, I think your predecessors, because I don't think anyone on the board tonight was on the board at that time. I don't know if Mr. Grant was on the board in 08. Actually, I think he spoke against this reg change back then, or a different reg change back then. some members on the board were very vocal about building heights, and they didn't appreciate the language being interpreted as 4 stories or 35 feet. So the reg was changed to add that language that I don't want to confuse it, but you just removed that language in March of this year. Then there was another reg change at the same time to section 6.2.6, restoration, to eliminate the last sentence and add the words "or reconstruction" to the title. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I have more of a long-standing interest in this, practicing in town for a few years now. At that time, I came and spoke against those changes, along with a few other land use professionals in town. As attorney Steve Studer, John Grant came and spoke against those. And for the same reason, I brought this forward tonight, where I suggested the board address the definition of building height, and with respect to the restoration section 6.2.6, that it caused an unfair impact on houses on the shoreline lots. I believe then, and I believe now, it made every house on the shoreline non-conforming at the time it was enacted, or if it had to be rebuilt, any existing house would have been non-conforming. So there was indirect and I think more reactionary responses to building height on the shoreline. I don't believe there was any study or independent review performed. The regs sort of haphazardly hitting and circling around the issue of building height addressed the symptom but not the root cause, which was the FEMA map special flood hazard areas, which was really what was the issue. And it's difficult to do true long-term planning or understand what the true cause or what the correct long-term policy should be when you're working day to day with limited resources trying to solve daily issues and concerns. And I understand the board's a volunteer board, and we appreciate the service that you do on a volunteer basis. But over time, this regulation or the issue, the underlying root cause, has never been really addressed. And once you identify or frame the problem correctly, then you can address it. So I think the real problem here is the interaction of the FEMA and state regulations and Milford's own regulations, section 5, that say you have to build to flood standards. Those interactions with how building height is defined. Right now, there's no distinction between building height on a interior lot or building height on a shoreline lot. So this application we brought tonight was to discuss the building lots on that are in special flood hazard area zones should have a different definition. Because what happens is, if you take the existing definition, there's many occasions where you don't start building your first floor till 10, 11, 12, 13 feet off the ground. Now, the reason that's important to know, and some people would say, well, that's what we want. We only want houses that are 35 feet. We don't want walls of 70-foot houses. And I noted in Mr. Sulkas's administrative summary, he mentioned that there was a concern of 70-foot houses. I don't think that that's accurate. I think that that's more of a, it's not scare tactic necessarily, but that's not really what the result would be. So the FEMA requirements elevate structures 99% of the time, which are single-family homes at base flood elevation plus 1 foot of freeboard. There's even a suggestion that, I think Milford right now is 1 foot of freeboard. There's a suggestion from the federal government that it should be 2 feet of freeboard, and in order to qualify for special grants, in order to lift your house or elevate your house or get other type of special funding from the federal government, they require 2 feet of freeboard. So, back to why it's important for you. The reason it's important is because I believe, my clients believe, I think other municipalities up and down the East Coast, and I've provided copies of proposed regs or moratoriums or things along those lines, or studies that are addressing building height, very similar to what we're talking about. It incentivizes houses that are 100 years old or 50 years old or 40 years old to be elevated because they are not subject to that height requirement because they're pre-existing. And I don't know that that's a long-term policy decision that a municipality should encourage or have an indirect policy effect of people being encouraged to elevate existing houses that are not up to code, that are not going to be fully compliant with today's building standards. Just briefly, the regs and the studies I've mentioned, Stone Harbor, New Jersey, there was a study by Asher Architects which discusses a lot of these policy issues, and they recommend starting the height measured from base flood elevation, which is what we're asking for. Town of Dewey Beach, New Jersey, instituted a moratorium on height restrictions so that they weren't going to enforce the height restrictions until they were able to either do a study or figure it out themselves how they were going to control the height restrictions on the shoreline. Some towns have regs that are exactly what we're proposing tonight, almost, like Westerly, Rhode Island. And Westerly, Rhode Island also established a flood hazard overlay. So houses in the special flood hazard zone had a different standard for height. It wasn't a foot for foot. You can start calculating your building height at base flood elevation, but there was some consideration given to those homeowners. So I don't know how the board, what the board's preference is or how the board feels about this topic. I would request that if you're not going to act on it tonight, that at some point in time, the board give direction to the city planner or look for some other means of a type of study or survey to address this as an overall policy versus let's change this reg and then a few years go by and we see the kind of impact that has. Okay, so let's change this reg. I think there should be an overall comprehensive change. That's what this is designed to do. However, this is our opinion on our application, and you may or may not know that the Tureks also are trying to get a house built that based on the design standard exceeds the 35, based on the way that Milford measures building height, exceeds the 35 feet by a foot or two or something along those lines. But there is a history to this, and this is something that should be addressed. The other part of it is that the regulations are currently treating houses in the same zone differently and it's not just a 1Z and 2Z variance type of situation where, I have a hardship, the topography of my lot, and come in and ask the ZBA for a hardship. This is 17 miles of shoreline in Milford, and it's obviously an issue that is a statewide issue as well. So it should be a more comprehensive look at how building height is. And measuring building height from what we're suggesting, the base flood elevation, would tie the building to its site-specific conditions, remove difficulties presented by determining what the grade is. I think there's another application later on this evening from Mr. Grant or your subcommittee discussing grade or eliminating a new way to calculate that. And it would actually have a minimal impact on building height. There's some studies that I've taken from those towns that I've filed that they say, the overall building height it's not houses are not going to be twice as high. You're talking, a few 4 to 6 feet difference usually in most cases. And pending your questions, that completes our application.
Thank you. Mr. Griffith, do you have comment?
Again, I would refer you to Mr. Sulcus's administrative summary, which was prepared 2 weeks ago, and we got it into Attorney Kersaden's hands for his, and I believe he's responded to a number of the concerns. But again, I would still ask you to go through Dave's review rather carefully.
Thank you. Are there questions for Attorney Kersaden at this time? Does anyone have any questions for Attorney Kersaden? Mr. Mead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What did you say your clients, if they built a house how tall would be? Would it be over the 35 foot?
Because of having to elevate it and the way that Milford defines building height, measuring from the average grade and the way the slope is off the shoreline, yes. But the house itself, from bottom part of the structure to the roof, as typically measured, would be 34.11 feet or something like that.
Plus 15 feet on top, below that for the elevation, for the...
Well, the house from the roof line to the bottom of the house is under 35 feet. But depending on how high they have to elevate it, if they're in a AE 13 zone, then yeah, then they have to go 15 feet. But that doesn't bump the house up 15 feet. It's the way the measurement actually plays itself out, for lack of a better term, is that actually the house is only like 3 or 4 feet over, very similar to the discussions that are in those studies. So it's not a foot for foot exchange. You don't take the 35-foot house, add 15 feet to it, just because you elevate the house 15 feet.
Well, you will if you measure from the ground. If you measure from the ground and not the top of the freeboard, yes.
It depends on the grade and the topography of the lot. If it's a steep slope lot, then the grade is different. It's not just a flat measurement. So you don't just add the 15 feet.
Well, that's what we're going to determine in the next proposals there.
That is not that proposal doesn't have it, it's not regarding specifically buildings in a special flood hazard zone. That's
Your client's property right on the shore, is it sloped or is it level?
This particular property is sloped.
So on the street side, it could be even, and then on the beach side, it could be 55, 60 feet to the peak of the house.
No, I disagree with that.
I mean from grade, from the ground, not from the top of where the freeboards are.
No, and this conversation we're having now is the reason why there should be a comprehensive study. If you decide that we're not comfortable acting on this, I think there should be a comprehensive study for the town, because it's confusing and it's taken me a while to wrap my head around it. I'm not an engineer, but as slowly working through this, I understand what you're saying, but that's not exactly the measure. That's not like I said. That's not how these measurements actually work out.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Additional questions for Mr. Crusaden? Seeing none, Mr. Grant?
Actually, I don't have any questions. I have some comments.
Please, go ahead.
Okay. Number one, I'd like to say this is a good start, but there is definitely some things that need to be worked out into this particular proposal. In going through what's being proposed, I did a little research. Just so you know, I went through FEMA documentation. I went through their coastal construction manual, the residential construction manual. I went through the flood insurance terms. I went through FEMA's Flood Smart Government website. I also went through the building codes, IBC and IRC, and also through the engineering, the ASCE standards for flood. And also, I spoke and I have some documentation from the National Flood Insurance Coordinator that she gave me for this. One thing about this particular proposal, you're basing it on basically residential, but any definition actually doesn't cover just residential. This would also cover commercial sites also. So it causes some problems with that. Also, some of the terms that you're using are not used in any FEMA documentation, not used in any building code documentation, and not used by the state of Connecticut in any form. Especially the one item you had is the height.
Height measuring point? Height measuring
building
point?
Height. Measuring the height measuring point, which is not used any place. You did mention about the freeboard. It is true, most of the insurance companies are looking for 2 feet. The particular structure that I know that your clients have is on Hillside Avenue. That is a site, and it does make, basically by current regulations, does make it go up over the 35 feet. On the back side. Front, it would actually meet. So there's there. But like I said, it's a good starting point. I would say that we definitely would need to look at something. It has been brought up before the board before to look at. But there are some major points, like I said, basically terms that aren't used in any FEMA or building code. Most of the items you have here, like base flood elevation, those are all used to establish the first floor.
Correct.
They're not really established for the height. So, like I said, at this particular point in time, I think it's a good starting point, but at this point, I would have to say it needs work.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. Are there additional questions for Mr. Crusaden or additional comment on the proposed changes? Seeing none at this point, I'm sorry, Mr. Dolan.
So my question, I guess, is for Mr. Grant. You say it's a good start. What can we do to tighten up the some other proposed regulations to hopefully solve this issue?
Basically, the premise has been that basically the properties along the shoreline are treated the same as an interior lot, but if they have to be raised, they basically make them non-conforming, which is true. Our plan of conservation actually says that if a property is been damaged more than 50%, it suggests that the city should be looking at purchasing it to make it open space. We have a regulation coming up to clarify height, which I think would help this particular structure that they want to do with a slight modification to that third floor, to the roof line. They would be able to meet the requirements with no problem. But we do need to look at our overall section on flood, and that does need to be changed, and there is some updates that need to be done to it.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. Thank you, Mr. Dolan. Are there additional questions or comment by the board at this time? Seeing none, at this point, we can open the matter up for public comment. If there is anyone that is interested in speaking either in favor or opposed to the proposed regulation changes, if I could ask that when you approach the podium, state your name and address, spelling your name. Please address all comments to the commission and keep them clear and succinct as possible. At this point, I'd like to say good evening, and please let us know if you're in favor or against the proposed regulations.
Good evening. I'm in favor of the proposed regulations, and I am speaking as the Public Works Director for the City of Milford, not as a private individual. And I just wanted to make sure the board was aware of some of the concerns that we are having presently with some of the coastal resiliency issues or coastal resiliency projects that we're presently looking at through the city. And just a little history, I read the article in the paper. That's one of the reasons I came to tonight's meeting. We have a regulation in the city that most of any new houses or raised houses, the first floor, or basement floor, I should say, has to be 18 inches above the center line. And in a lot of these low-lying areas over the last 10 to 15 years, that regulation has not been followed. And we have a lot of the basement levels, which I call garages in the floodplain areas that are almost flat with the roads. And when we're trying to use a drainage project where we tip the road or put drainage that drains appropriately, we really don't have the opportunity to do that throughout the city in these low-lying areas because we don't have enough pitch. That's the number one concern. And I just want the board to really grasp, when we're going to these storm resiliency projects, there's a real concern about sea level rise. And I know people have the argument, is it not? The facts are that any scientist that's looked at that, so we have a concern with the trajectory of sea level rise. And this issue that's before you right now is not going to be fixed in 1 or 2 years. This is a 30 or 40-year process as houses or homeowners come before the board looking for some, to raise houses, renovate houses. you want to have the opportunity for people to raise houses appropriately, and actually, I believe, higher than what even the flood elevation is requiring, if you look at the science behind it. And as the Public Works Director, a lot of these projects that we're looking at are just very, very challenging. And Bayview Beach is one of them. We have $1.6 million, and we have a house that was raised probably 6 or 7 years ago that, because of the height restriction, wasn't raised appropriately. And to the level that it would have been, and it really has been a challenge in that area to do a design that will make sense. In addition, the other areas that you have is off-street parking. So yeah, people can shorten the house, but then you have less opportunity for off-street parking underneath houses. The higher the house is, the more opportunity you have for parking underneath the house. These are the concerns that as a Public Works Director I'm looking at. And I would hope the board would, and I agree, I think the language has to be cleaned up a little bit. There's a lot of variables. I know there was some concern about, hey, what if there's a 70-foot house? The simple math to that would never happen. Even on a low-lying area where the base ground level is 4, and it was in a VE 15, I believe your house wouldn't be higher than 45 feet. And that's at the peak. So I would ask the board to seriously look at this text change, and obviously go through the paces with it and see what you think would be more appropriate. But I think we really have an issue throughout the city in these low-lying areas, and we have to address it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Saley. Is there anyone else that wishes to be heard in favor of the proposed text change? Good evening, sir. And please state your name and address for the record.
My name's Jack Turek. My wife Donna Weaver and I have the house at 59 Hillside Avenue that you've all been talking about. And we've been trying to rebuild our house for the past 5 years, basically ever since Irene and Sandy. I also forgot my reading glasses too, so you have to bear with me a little bit. We started out by we hired an architect and a structural engineer to help us with the design of the house. And we basically told them there are 3 things that we want you to do. The first thing is that the house must comply with all zoning regulations for an R5 lot, a standard R5 lot. And I said, because that's the type of lot we have. The second is that we must meet or exceed all of the local, state, and federal regulations that are required in a FEMA flood zone as far as wind and wave action are concerned. And third, we wanted the house to have a zero carbon footprint to try to get a LEED certified house and energy efficient and all the other things they're doing. We found out that in the flood zone regulations, there is no mention of average grade in any of the flood zone regulations. They rather use mean sea level, or MSL, in other words like freeboard, onto that one for it. So basically, when Milford measures the height of a house from average grade for it, these measurements, when you apply it to a FEMA flood zone, are basically illegal. In other words, normal R5 lot, you go to build a house. In fact, I used to work for an architectural firm, and they said, when you have normal plans, the base of the house is always shown at 0 elevation, and then everything goes up from there, and your basements go negative, because they said when you get a set of plans and you put it on a lot, it's always assumed you're going to be building that house on the average grade, whatever that average grade is of the lot. You don't put it up. And so therefore, that's the only thing they're concerned about. Also with FEMA, they don't care about the height of your house. They give you wind loads that you have to meet. So if you build a 90-foot house, you better make sure you've got a lot of steel in it, because there's no way you're going to meet the wind load specifications. But they want to make sure that that base level where the waters can come up to is not going to cause any damage. So that's why they only care about base flood elevation, and as you pointed out before, Mr. Grant, there are just a number of different words that they use, and almost every one of them have different acronyms that they start using. We also were looking at the history of the average grade, and it looked like way back when a lot of people were building houses that met the height from an average grade or whatever, and then later on, they would come over and then raise their house after it met the 35-foot one. And this, they did it to get a better view of something or whatever their reasons. Basically, they're circumventing your 35-foot limit. Well, the thing is, in a flood zone, when you raise a house, the only reason, true reason for raising a house is to save lives and basically prevent future damage. And that is the reason why now FEMA's come up with these regulations telling you, you must raise your house up. They've learned the hard way that when you don't do that and things happen, that's when life is lost, property is lost, and everything else. So therefore, they've mandated these particular rules. A lot of other towns we're looking at run into problems because if you use a set elevation, let's say it's, 2 feet above grade or something like that, and then they go ahead and change the FEMA regulations, you're there changing your zoning regulations every other year to keep up with all the flood ones. So what they do is in a flood zone, which means it doesn't affect anywhere else. In other words, if we took the house we designed right now and put it on any R5 lot in Milford, there would be no zoning problems at all. It would meet the 35-foot regulation, it would meet structural, it would meet all of that. Our only problem is our lot was about 9-foot average grade, and we went over and FEMA said we have to go to 13 feet plus 1 foot to make it 14. Then HUD, no, I'm sorry, we had to go to 15 foot, we had to go to 2 foot of freeboard. Then all of a sudden, Connecticut HUD came to us and they said, yes, we will help you with your rebuilding of your house. But by the way, we're not taking 2 foot of freeboard, we want 3 feet of feedboard. And I looked at them and I said, guys, this is getting to the point right now where structurally I cannot make the house go any higher because now I can't meet the wind load. So I've been arguing with HUD to say, look, since the garage is at the bottom part, can we consider that non-habitable area of the house, and therefore, since my first floor is above it, can we say that the house is 17 feet above for the other one? And they're looking at giving a leeway to that. But the problem is, all of these agencies, when they keep coming, are constantly changing it. And I'm actually in favor of it, even though it's a hardship for me to try to build something. They have my life in basically, it's top on their mind. They really want to help save lives. They really want to eliminate damage. And that's basically what I'm doing. And the house we're trying to build, my dream was that, yes, we have another big hurricane coming up. I invite all the news crews over and say, look, you want to be in a house that's actually built to withstand things, that's built on solid rock that come up like that. You can build a house along the shoreline that basically meets and is very safe. There's other sections of Milford where I would not try to build a house because of the sand in the lot, because it basically, structurally, you're going to have a problem when it comes up. But there are lots that if things are built correctly, you can actually have a model house basically to show how safely you can have a coastal community and things to fit in it. That's about it. Sorry, I got a little longer than I did since I couldn't read my writing.
Thank you, Mr. Turek. Is there anyone else with us this evening that would like to be heard in favor of the proposed regulation changes? Seeing none, I will ask if there's anyone that wishes to be heard from the public against the proposed regulation changes. Seeing none, Mr. Krisaden, do you wish to add anything further at this time?
No, thank you.
Thank you. At this point, that concludes the public comment portion of the public hearing, but before we close the public hearing, if I could ask Mr. Griffith, at this time, there has been some talk about further working on the regulation changes as proposed. Would it be advisable at this point to keep the public hearing open and give the opportunity for the applicant to work with the department towards that end? Is that something that would be advisable?
I would leave that to the applicant, but yeah, we would like to, I mean, in deference to Mr. Grant's comments and I think some of the concerns regarding,
Yes, that's,
again, in sync with that, we'd be happy to work with him.
we're in agreement if that's the board's choice, Mr. Chairman.
Is there any one on the board that would be in opposition to us doing that at this time? Okay, seeing none, we will keep the public hearing open and continue that for another agenda. And we'll be in communication with the department as to when that would be. Thank you very much, Mr. Krisadny. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Turek.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is item D5, proposed text regulation changes submitted by the Planning and Zoning Board. They are 3 to Article 4, Section 4.1.16.2, watercourses and water bodies, Article 11, definitions, building height, Article 11, definitions, grade plane average. And I will turn it over to Mr. Grant.
The first change on watercourse wetlands, if you look at the documentation that you were provided, there is a letter from Mr. Salkis that basically describes basically what the changes are. It's basically the proposal would allow buildings or structures to be constructed with less than 25 feet, including tidal wetlands. It's really kind of a maintenance item to clean up the regulations between the inland wetlands and the zoning regulations. I think
Mr. Griffith, any comment on that, on 5A?
Yeah, to reinforce what Mr. Grant was just saying, those provisions in the regulations are typically dealing with the 25 feet from a line, and whereas the flood zone obviously is an area as well as the inland wetlands area. So the inland wetlands are obviously regulated by the Inland Wetlands Commission. The flood zone continues to be regulated under Section 5.8 of our floodplain regulations. And so that's where anything within that 25-foot line now from the shoreline, what have you, watercourse, would still be subject to the special exception under our regulations.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the board for Mr. Griffith or Mr. Grant as to item 5A? Seeing nothing from the board, I would imagine it'd probably be best if there's public comment to take them on each proposed regulation. At this time, if there is anyone that wishes to be heard from the public as to what was just discussed by Mr. Grant, which is the regulation change to Article 4, Section 4.1.16.2. Is there anyone that wishes to be heard? Seeing none, we will close the public comment, and I don't think does anyone see any reason to keep the public hearing open for item 5A? Then we'll move on to item 5B, Article 9, definitions, building height. Mr. Grant?
Okay. Basically, the existing, again, this is kind of a maintenance item. There's been confusion in the past for a number of years, as you can probably see from what Mr. Krisadny had given you. I spoke before the Planning and Zoning Board a number of years ago about this. It's kind of not 100% clear as to actually how to figure the building height. So we've redone some of the text to clean it up and make it more clear and put it more in layman terms. It basically still says the same thing. It just clarifies the wording so that it can be clearly understood.
Thank you. Mr. Griffith?
Yeah, again, to reinforce what John has just said, I'm on the the subcommittee as well as the building official for the city of Milford, and these revisions take the definition of building height relative to the grade and bring it in alignment with the building code. So again, we're now consistent with what the building officials are looking at.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Grant or Mr. Griffith as to item 5B? Seeing none, I'll ask if there are any members of the public that wish to be heard with regard to the proposed text regulation change to Article 11 definitions, building height. Good evening, ma'am. If I could ask that you state your name and address for the record, please.
Donna Dutko, 236 Buckingham Avenue. I just have a question. I didn't do my homework. What does the definition of building height say now, or what are the changes? Is there, could I just get a copy of the definition? I just wanted to read, I'll read it, and if you have any questions, I'll...
Okay. We'll come. Mr. Turek.
I'm not sure which one should correct me on this. The only question I had is when I looked over some of the wording, I agree with almost everything in it, except there's a section that was talking about the shed roof. Instead of measuring from the midpoint like you do with gable roofs, you measure from the peak. Would this be not the point to talk about that, or would it? That's the only question, the only comment I was having, the difference between the shed and the gable roof, using the midpoint.
Mr. Grant, is that something that can be addressed now?
Basically, the building height would be taken on a shed roof
Right.
from the highest point.
Right, and that's the one that I had. Would that be in this section? Because that's the one thing that I did disagree with. And again, when I was looking at building an energy efficient house, I started looking into a lot of different roof designs right now. And it turned out that because we had a small lot and our footprint of our house was going to be small, we didn't have that much of an area. So we had a limited roof space when we went over. And it turned out that in order to be energy efficient, I needed the maximum amount of solar cells to be able to get the energy I needed. And a shed roof design gave me that particular one. So, and it turns out that, well, in all things, if you have a gable roof, and if I could just use this to show it, and the sun's coming down from that direction, you put solar cells on this side, that's as much as solar ones. If you have a shed roof, that's basically this. You have twice the area of solar cells that you can have with a gable roof, because by definition with a gable roof, half of the roof is, you can't put the solar cells on because they're facing away from the sun, type of thing. So putting a hardship on people that are trying to maximize the energy efficiency of their house and decide to, let's say, use a shed roof instead of a gable roof, and saying, I'm going to count your house higher than people that put gable roofs on, which wouldn't be as energy efficient, I think is just sending the wrong message to people that are trying to be green and trying to do things for it. And I had no problem before with a shed roof taking the midpoint the same way you do with the gable roofs right now. That's a very fair way of doing it. I've heard a lot of people say, well, use the peak and raise the height of the house, and that way there's no question at all, you know, about what the height is, and that's true too, but most people use the midpoint of the roof. And the only problem I had was putting a shed roof in the category of a flat roof and basically putting a restriction on it, especially now when shed roofs seem to be more energy efficient or give you more room for solar cells than the gable roof would. So that was my only concern about that particular wording, is the fact that you were penalizing people for using a shed roof design as opposed to people that use gable roof designs when it comes to building height.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Ms. Dutko, did you have additional comment on the regulation? Thank you. Is there anyone that wishes, anyone additional that wishes to be heard relative to the proposed text regulation changes? Seeing none, does anyone have any additional questions for Mr. Grant or Mr. Griffith as to this item?
I have
Mr. Grant.
a comment for you. Basically on the shed roof, in drafting this particular regulation, one of the references that we used was also the Connecticut Building Code, and basically shed roofs are measured to the peak when you look at those particular codes. So that was a factor in putting this in as a shed roof to use the peak, to use the highest point. Because we didn't want to have a regulation that basically you go do something to meet the zoning regulations, and then you can't do it. When you take it to the building department, they tell you, no, we're sorry, you can't do this. And the same thing with the height regulations. The building code says that the space underneath is basically counted as a story, and the residential code is 3 stories high. So, and if you took and did as you had proposed in the previous thing, if you measured from the first floor level, basically you would be building a 4-story house. You'd have to go before the state building inspector to get a special exception to use the residential code to build the house rather than using a commercial code to build the house, which would be a lot more stringent.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. Is there anything further at this time? Any comment on this item as to the definition of building height from the board? Seeing none, does anyone see any reason why we cannot close the public hearing as to this proposed text regulation change? We will close it as to that item, 5B. Next, move on to item 5C, Article 11 definitions, grade plane average. Mr. Grant?
Again, this is a clarification of the, basically it's a new definition, but it's a clarification that comes out from the existing building code, building height zoning regulation. It says average grade in the existing regulation. However, it doesn't really state how do you determine what that average grade is. And there's been some questions as to how you actually do that. So we basically pulled it out of the building height section of the existing regulation and turned it into its own so that it's clearly defined on the procedure and the method and how to calculate what the average grade is.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. Mr. Griffin, anything?
Sorry, I have nothing more to say.
Any questions for Mr. Grant as to this item, as to grade plane average? Seeing none, we'd open that for comment from the public. Does anyone wish to be heard on the proposed text regulation change to Article 11 definition of grade plane average? Seeing none, does anyone see any reason why we cannot close the public hearing as to item 5C at this time? So we will close the public hearing as to that item, and we would have then, I guess, three items. We should probably take those as 3 separate motions. Does anyone wish to make a motion relative to the approval of item 5A, water courses and water bodies? Mr. Dolan.
I'd like to make a motion
Mr. Grant.
to approve Article 4, Section 4.1.16.2, water course and water bodies.
Is there a second? Mr. Dolan. Does anyone wish to be heard on the motion? Mr. Quish.
Just wondering if we could put all together, or do we need to do them separately?
My inclination is to keep them separate because of their 3 separate regulation changes, just 3 separate sections. Anything further before we call the question? Then we will call the question. All in favor of the motion? All opposed? The motion passes. Next, we'll take up 5D, Article 11, definitions, building height. Does anyone wish to make a motion as to that proposed text regulation change? Mr. Lutz.
I propose that we pass the new regulation as presented.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Mr. Marlowe. Is there any discussion as to the motion? Seeing none, we'll call the question. All in favor of the motion? Aye. All opposed? The motion passes. The next and last item is 5C, grade plane average, Article 11 definitions. Does anyone wish to make a motion? Mr. Dolan?
I'll make a motion to approve as presented by Mr. Grant.
Is there a second? Mr. Nichol? Does anyone wish to be heard on the motion? Seeing none, we'll call the motion for a question. All in favor? All opposed? The motion passes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Grant, and thank you to the Regulations Subcommittee. The next item on our agenda is liaison reports. Are there any liaison reports this evening? Mr. Nichol?
Yeah, I attended the inland wetland meeting, and there are a couple public hearings that are still outstanding. In regards to the Grillo proposal for apartments and a approval for a homeowner to do some building in his backyard.
Are there any questions for Mr. Nichol? Seeing none, are there any other liaison reports this evening? No further liaison reports. Next on the agenda is the Regulations Subcommittee update. Mr. Grant, is there a report?
Nothing at this time.
The next item on the agenda is the approval of minutes from our September 6, 2016 meeting. Does anyone wish to make a motion to approve those minutes?
I make a motion to approve.
Mr. Grant, is there a second? Mr. Marlowe? Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of approving the minutes? Aye. All opposed? The motion passes. The minutes are approved. Next item agenda is the chair's report, and the only item that I have this evening is a notice that Ms. Leggett passed out at the beginning of the meeting for the Land Use Academy, the University of Connecticut Center for Land Use Education and Research, Land Use Academy Advanced Training. That'll be taking place on October 22nd, 2016, and it certainly is a great resource available to members of the board, and I encourage members of the board to look into that. And just stepping back, or after that, following up on the regulation changes, they will be effective October 14, 2016. And that would conclude my report for this evening. And our next item on the agenda is a staff report. Mr. Griffith, do you have a report for us, or do you wish to give us a report this evening?
Staff has no report.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the agenda. The chair will entertain a motion to adjourn. Mr. Mead, is there a second? Mr. Marlowe, all in favor? We stand adjourned.